In September 1987, in the heart of Brazil, an ordinary day quietly marked the beginning of one of the worst radiological disasters in history. It didn't begin with an explosion. There was no mushroom cloud, no warning sirens, and no military alert. Instead, everything started inside an abandoned hospital, where an old radiotherapy machine had been left behind after the building was closed. Hidden within its heavy steel structure was a small capsule containing cesium-137, an intensely radioactive substance once used to treat cancer patients. The machine had been forgotten. Its owners had walked away. Authorities failed to secure the site. For years, the dangerous device remained exactly where it had been abandoned, exposed to thieves, scavengers, and anyone curious enough to enter the decaying building. To most people, it looked like nothing more than a large piece of obsolete medical equipment. No warning sign could truly explain the invisible danger locked inside. Days later, two men searching for scrap metal discovered the machine. Like countless others trying to earn a living by selling metal, they believed they had found something valuable. Without any knowledge of radiation or nuclear materials, they began dismantling the enormous equipment piece by piece. Every bolt they removed brought them closer to the radioactive source sealed inside. Hours of work finally allowed them to remove one of the heaviest sections. It was far more difficult than they expected, but the effort seemed worthwhile. They loaded the metal onto a wheelbarrow and took it to a nearby scrapyard. At that moment, no one realized they were transporting one of the most dangerous radioactive sources ever left unprotected. What happened next would contaminate families, destroy lives, and leave scars that remain visible decades later. The disaster had already begun. No one knew it yet. But a tiny capsule, no larger than a small container, was about to poison an entire city. The scrapyard owner, Dever Alves Ferreira, had spent years buying and selling discarded metal. To him, the damaged radiotherapy machine looked like an ordinary piece of industrial equipment that could be dismantled and sold for profit. Curious about the strange device, he and his employees continued taking it apart. Deep inside the machine, they finally reached a small stainless steel capsule unlike anything they had ever seen. It was heavy, carefully engineered, and seemed to protect something valuable hidden inside. Determined to discover its contents, they worked for hours until the capsule finally opened. What emerged was unlike anything they had expected. Inside was a fine powder that emitted a faint, mesmerizing blue glow. It looked almost magical. The light seemed alive, softly illuminating the darkness around it. None of them had ever seen anything like it. Instead of fear, they felt fascination. Dever was captivated by its beauty. Believing he had discovered something extraordinary, he proudly showed the glowing material to friends, neighbors, and members of his own family. Some people touched it with their bare hands. Others rubbed it across their skin. Children played with the glowing powder as if it were harmless glitter. Small fragments were carried home inside pockets, on clothing, and even under fingernails. The radioactive material spread silently from house to house. Every handshake, every embrace, every shared object carried invisible contamination to new victims. Meanwhile, the first symptoms began to appear. Several people complained of nausea, dizziness, and persistent vomiting. Painful burns started forming on their skin. Hair began falling out in unusual amounts. No one connected these mysterious illnesses to the beautiful blue powder. Doctors suspected food poisoning, infections, or common diseases. Radiation poisoning was almost unimaginable. As more people became sick, the invisible disaster continued to expand across Goiânia. Without realizing it, the city was entering one of the most terrifying public health emergencies in modern history. As the days passed, the number of sick people continued to grow. Entire families began experiencing the same disturbing symptoms. Severe nausea, relentless vomiting, dizziness, weakness, and strange burns appeared without any clear explanation. The glowing powder had already spread far beyond the scrapyard. Pieces of cesium-137 had contaminated homes, furniture, clothing, buses, streets, and workplaces. No one could see it, no one could smell it, yet every passing hour exposed more people to deadly levels of radiation. Among those fascinated by the mysterious blue glow was de Vere's 6-year-old niece, Lade Desneves Ferreira. Like any curious child, she was enchanted by the sparkling powder. She played with it for hours, unaware that every second brought her closer to a fatal dose of radiation. Tiny radioactive particles covered her hands. Some were accidentally swallowed while she ate. Others remained on her skin and clothing, exposing everyone around her. Meanwhile, doctors remained confused. Patients arrived with symptoms that resembled severe infections or chemical poisoning. Treatments failed. The illnesses only became worse. It wasn't until de Vere's wife, Gabriela Maria Ferreira, began to suspect that the strange metal capsule might somehow be responsible that the investigation finally changed direction. Despite feeling increasingly ill herself, she gathered what remained of the mysterious object, placed it inside a plastic bag, and took it by bus to a local medical clinic. Even then, no one realized the danger sitting only a few feet away. The capsule was handled by several people before specialists were finally called. When radiation experts arrived with Geiger counters, the instruments immediately began screaming. The readings were unlike anything they had expected. The source wasn't simply radioactive. It was catastrophically radioactive. Within hours, authorities understood they were no longer dealing with isolated medical cases. An entire city had been contaminated. The invisible killer had already escaped, and finding everyone who had come into contact with the glowing blue powder would become a race against time. The discovery of the cesium source triggered one of the largest emergency responses in Brazilian history. Within hours, scientists, health officials, firefighters, and military personnel flooded the streets of Goiânia carrying Geiger counters, protective suits, and decontamination equipment. The radiation detectors clicked relentlessly. By the time the contamination had been identified, it was already too late for many of those who had been exposed. Inside hospitals, doctors watched helplessly as radiation sickness progressed with terrifying speed. Healthy people who had felt only mild nausea days earlier were now suffering from severe internal damage. The human body had begun to destroy itself from the inside. Among the victims, none became more symbolic than 6-year-old Lade Desneves Ferreira. The little girl who had been fascinated by the beautiful blue powder was now fighting for her life. She had unknowingly handled the cesium-137 for hours, carrying radioactive particles on her hands and accidentally ingesting some of the material while eating. In the months that followed the disaster, Goiânia became one of the largest decontamination operations ever carried out outside a nuclear facility. Specialized teams worked around the clock, scanning every street, every building, and every object that might have come into contact with the radioactive material. Thousands of tons of contaminated soil, furniture, clothing, household items, and even entire structures were carefully removed and sealed inside specially designed containers. Several homes were demolished completely. Others were abandoned forever. What had once been ordinary neighborhoods had become symbols of one of history's most devastating radiological accidents. The cesium-137 capsule was eventually secured, and the immediate danger came to an end. But its consequences never truly disappeared. Many survivors continued to suffer from long-term health complications. Others faced discrimination simply because they had lived in Goiânia. Fear spread almost as quickly as the radiation itself. The disaster forced governments around the world to completely rethink how radioactive medical equipment should be stored, monitored, and disposed of. International safety regulations became stricter. Hospitals introduced new security protocols. Abandoned radioactive sources were no longer viewed as forgotten equipment, but as potential disasters waiting to happen. Today, the Goiânia accident remains one of the worst radiological accidents in human history, not because of a reactor failure or a nuclear weapon, but because of a single medical device left behind without protection. It proved that one of the greatest dangers of nuclear technology is not always found inside power plants or military facilities. Sometimes it begins with a simple mistake, an unlocked door, a forgotten machine, a decision that seems insignificant. The glowing blue powder that fascinated an entire community became a tragic reminder that radiation offers no warning, no sound, and no mercy. It cannot be seen. It cannot be smelled. And once released, its consequences can outlive generations. The Goiânia accident is more than a story about radiation. It is a story about responsibility, about negligence, and about the terrible price humanity pays when dangerous knowledge is forgotten. Sometimes, history's greatest disasters don't begin with explosions. Sometimes, they begin with silence. The dose she received was devastating. Despite every effort by doctors, her condition rapidly deteriorated. On October 23, 1987, Lade died from acute radiation syndrome. Her death shocked the entire country. Yet even after her passing, fear of radiation remained so intense that her funeral became another tragedy. Hundreds of people gathered outside the cemetery to protest the burial, terrified that her body could contaminate the surrounding area. Authorities had to reassure the public that every safety precaution had been taken. Even then, fear overcame reason. The image of a child rejected in death because of an invisible contaminant became one of the most haunting symbols of the Goiânia disaster. In total, 4 people lost their lives as a direct result of the accident. More than 200 were contaminated. Thousands underwent radiation screening. Entire homes, vehicles, furniture, clothing, and personal belongings had to be destroyed because they could no longer be safely decontaminated. For many families, the disaster did not end when the radiation was removed. The psychological scars, social stigma, and health concerns would remain for decades. What had begun as an abandoned medical machine had forever changed the lives of an entire community. But the legacy of Goiânia would reach far beyond Brazil, forcing the world to confront a dangerous question. How could such a catastrophic disaster have happened in the first place? Every alarm revealed another contaminated location. Homes, cars, shops, schools. Entire neighborhoods had unknowingly become radioactive. The contamination had spread much farther than anyone imagined. As investigators retraced the path of the capsule, they realized that radioactive particles had been carried across the city through ordinary human contact. People had embraced relatives, shared meals, traveled on buses, sold contaminated objects. Every interaction had silently expanded the disaster. Authorities established isolation zones almost overnight. Roads were closed. Entire blocks were evacuated. Families were ordered to leave their homes with only the clothes they were wearing. Many watched as radiation experts marked their houses with warning signs before declaring them unsafe to enter. Thousands of residents lined up for radiation screening. Portable detectors scanned one person after another, searching for invisible contamination. For many, the sound of a Geiger counter became a symbol of fear. Some people tested negative and returned home relieved. Others heard the instruments accelerate as they approached. Those individuals were immediately separated from the crowd and transported for further examination. News of the accident spread rapidly across Brazil. Fear soon turned into panic. People from Goiânia found themselves treated with suspicion wherever they traveled. Hotels refused to accept guests from the city. Some buses were disinfected before continuing their routes. Products from Goiás were rejected in other regions, even when they posed no risk at all. Radiation had become more than a medical emergency. It had become a social crisis. Behind sealed doors and contamination barriers, doctors continued fighting to save the most severely exposed victims. But for some of them, the damage had already gone far beyond what modern medicine could repair. The worst consequences of the Goiânia accident were still yet to come.